Good evening and welcome to The Core, coming to you live from Channels Television Studios in Abuja, Nigeria. I am Kadria Ahmed. Up to 4 people are feared to have died yesterday in a communal dispute in Orogbam, a village in Abanwa local government area of Cross River State. A land dispute is believed to have led to the conflict, in which the warring communities also set several houses ablaze. In Delta State, a lingering boundary dispute between the Alaja and Ogbe Ijo communities in Udu, Warri, Southwest local government area escalated in October with dire consequences. 9 people were killed. Just 6 weeks ago in Kaduna State, a dispute between wheelbarrow pushers in a market in Kajuru local government area expanded and consumed the Muslim and Christian communities of the town in which the market was located. By the time it was brought under control, 55 people lay dead. Tragically, across Nigeria, sectarian violence is now too commonplace. In Taraba and Plateau states, neighbors slaughter neighbors at the slightest provocation, almost as if all that is needed is an excuse. Indeed, there's hardly any part of Nigeria that does not suffer from sectarian clashes. Despite this, no one, including security agencies and the government, seem able to put a stop to the violence. So, how did we get here? What are the underlying causes of these troubles? What has been the impact of the violence and killings on our psyche and the fabric of our society? And why is the state failing in its primary duty of securing its citizens? What are the challenges it is facing that have hobbled its ability to come to grip with this major problem? We examine these and many more questions on today's edition of The Core. To discuss the problem of violence, intolerance, and sectarian killings in Nigeria today, I'm joined by the Solicitor General of Kaduna State, Mr. Chris Umar. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you very much, Kaduna.
Okay, Mr. Chris Umar, public affairs analyst and also author, whose latest book, Fate of the Union, Breaking the Curse of Identity Politics, deals with some of the issues we'll be discussing, is also here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. We also have Ms. Kemi Okenyodu. She's the Director of Partners West Africa, Nigeria. Her expertise and focus is on security and governance. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least is Professor Ken Ife, a lead consultant with the ECOWAS Commission. His expertise is on the impact of violent conflict. Is that correct, sir? Yes? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
If I may start with you, Chris, why is it that today in Nigeria, violence seems to be just bubbling beneath what is a veneer of peace, and that at the slightest provocation, people seem to be able to just kill each other? What is going on?
I think there are a multiplicity of factors responsible for this. But the most basic ones are, I think, firstly, that violence is woven into the fabric of our political economy, because the political economy has created a system that allocates reward or access to social and economic opportunity based on identity. So identity politics becomes important. Identity politics by itself is exclusionary. That is, it depends on definitions of who is in, who is part of the group, and who is outside of the group. So it promotes an ethic of exclusion. Now, if you take that and you combine it with the fact that Nigeria is a mono-resource economy, and essentially it distributes rents from the sale of crude oil, that is what our economy is centered on, you find that In the 1970s, for example, it was possible to run that sort of system because the population was far less than what it is now. We were between 40 million to 50 million. Oil revenues were doing very well. There was an oil boom. But in the last 4 decades, our population has quadrupled. And we have a very young population. There are 90 million Nigerians under 30. So 90 million people need education, they need jobs, they need social and economic opportunities. If you separated that 90 million, it would still be probably the most populous country in Africa. So that creates a lot of pressure for delivery of governance, delivery of social services, delivery of things like social mobility, for example. In the absence of those things, you find that the identity politics becomes even more rabid because there are now more mouths chasing fewer resources.
I'm still struggling to understand how that translates into a fight between 2 wheelbarrow pushers in a state like Kaduna, and then suddenly Muslims are killing Christians.
Well, a state like Kaduna is probably exactly the sort of place where that sort of thing would happen. I live in Jos. We also record those kind of things where altercations between individuals speedily become altercations between communities. These are how, when you have identity politics as a setting, this is how things are framed. The individuals are almost irrelevant. They become representatives of larger groups. So many times, because of the Nigerian state's failure to punish crime consistently, criminal acts quickly become interpreted as acts of groups rather than acts of individuals.
Let me bring Kemi here. What is your experience of the issues, the underlying issues that cause this kind of problems?
Just like Chris has said, the underlying factors are linked to, I'll say, our perennial fault lines. As it is, as a country, we've not come together as a nation. The concept of being a nation is far from us. We all fall along either ethnic or religious fault lines. You first see yourself as part of your ethnic group or your religious group before you see yourself as a Nigerian.
And yet, my issue is still this. It is quite possible for you to be proud of a certain identity. But why does that then translate to animosity for the other group?
Yeah, because it's still the same thing. There must be a gel that is keeping all of us together. So where there is scarcity, where there's a breakdown in governance, let me not put it as a result of scarcity of anything. It's a breakdown in governance. It's a system whereby the politicians exploit that perennial fault lines. Rather than see what brings us together, they seek to entrench what divides us. So you find the average Nigerian is looking, even when we're talking, let me use farmers herdsmen conflict as an example. In all of this, nobody's talking about climate change. Nobody's talking about the effect of climate change on grazing land, on availability of water, which is causing some form of tension. Rather, you seek to look at it from the perennial fault line.
The ethnic
differences. And closely related to ethnic differences is religion. You could almost sense that if this person is from this group, the person is most likely of this religious grouping.
Okay. Let me bring in the Mr. Umar in here. I mean, strictly speaking, you're not a politician, but you're a political appointee. And your state is sort of notorious, along with perhaps Plateau and Taraba, for these kind of sectarian problems. Listening to both Chris and to Kemi, it would appear that the fault is firmly that of your bosses, the people who appointed you into office, that it is politicians that are causing this trouble. Is that how the Kaduna state government sees the challenges that they're facing with sectarian violence? Or is it that, in your view, there are other issues?
Thank you very much, Kadaria. In my view, absolutely, there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of other issues compounding to these issues we have had in Kaduna State. Kaduna has had its own fair share of conflicts, like you rightly pointed out, starting from the crisis in 1980 in Kasuwa Magani to the post-presidential election in 2011 and what we just had in Kaduna. But if you look at the trajectory of conflicts in Kaduna, quite a number of issues, quite a number of factors have kept occurring as the remote causes for some of these conflicts. Now, some of these issues that we've checked, I've had the privilege of reading some of the reports we've had in the past, especially the Lemu committee and then that of Luther Agwe. If you look at it critically, some of the issues that keep reoccurring that I would say are constant decimal. There's the issue of land. Land is a major issue. You would agree with me that land is our most important factor of production. Quite a number of our livelihood depends on land. So there's the issue of land, which you can trace to as far back as the colonial era, or the issue of climate change. You know, so gradually the land, there's the issue also of the grazing reserves, the herdsmen issue and farmers, you know, and then there's the climate issue which has made it worse, environmental factors which has also increased all that issue. Secondly, there's also the issue of youth unemployment, which is on the increase. If you look at, like you said in your opening remarks, my friend said in his opening remarks, we have a huge population that is that's entirely youth. In Kaduna, over 54% of the population of Kaduna are young persons. And then there's this increasing unequal access to economic opportunities. So these youths are always there with little or nothing to do, no jobs, no loans. So they're there, they are willing, they're just there ready in the hands, they're willing tools for people to use them for whatever reason. There's also the issue of, how would I even put it, there's also the issue of neglect of women and these youths. Whenever we have conflicts, people sit down, whenever we invite people to come and sit down and find resolutions or areas where we can resolve these disputes, the youth and women are not invited to the table. So you find where you have traditional rulers coming to sign one treaty or the other. The young persons who are directly affected by this, the outcomes of these conflicts are not invited.
Let me ask Professor Ken, you know, we sit down and we talk about politicians exploiting fault lines. We talk about climate change, and we talk about triggers around youth unemployment and all of those things. What about citizens? I mean, why is it so easy for people to be manipulated? Why is it that a young person is able to sort of kill another person? Because I still struggling with the idea that you can kill somebody just so easily, because it's not something that is normal, that you should be able to kill other people and walk away simply because you don't have work or that person speaks a different language from you. What are the things that you found in the course of the work that you're doing?
I think one thing that we couldn't wish away is the doctrinal foundation of security and defense, which tended over the years to emphasize the use of force rather than dialogue, rather than alternative dispute mechanisms. And of course, as you just pointed out, bringing in all the actors around the table when we are disposed to negotiate a settlement. If the young people who perpetrate the crimes are not part of the solution, then you haven't achieved very much. I think that's an important aspect.
We'll take a very short break. Don't go away. Welcome back. You are watching The Core, and we are discussing violence, intolerance, and sectarian killings in Nigeria. If you're at home and you want to join the conversation, you can do so on our social media handles: Twitter at Channels TV or at Kadria Ahmed, YouTube at Channels Web. Please use the hashtag #NGTheCore. You can also follow us on Facebook at Channels Forum. Chris, let me come back to you. Before the break, the professor had alluded to a culture of violence, perhaps rooted in our military history, where I guess the state exercised a certain degree of control, you know, through force. But what we have at the moment is that the state is no longer, if you like, the only owner of violence. And essentially, we have democratized violence. What impact has this had on the issues that we're facing?
It has a great impact. But could I just back up a bit
Sure.
and emphasize the centrality of identity politics too? The question you asked earlier about why it has become so easy for people to kill neighbors, identity politics by its very nature devalues the individual. That is what it does, because the individual does not matter. If I am Idoma, then that is, I'm not by myself, I have no value. I am only relevant because I belong to a larger group. So it is easier to dehumanize people where you have a rabid identity politics, such as we have. Secondly, under those conditions, the way people are socialized is also different. People are not socialized to see each other as compatriots or co-creators of national prosperity. They see each other as competitors for resources. So if you're in a land dispute, for example, that land dispute becomes an existential conflict. A resource conflict becomes an existential conflict, because if you don't have it, the other person will have it, and that is, not tolerable. So when you take that, this in fact feeds into this other narrative of the democratization of violence that we've seen. The state in many places has lost, let us say, legitimacy. So, for example, 52% of Nigeria is rural. Rural communities are underserved by police resources, law enforcement assets, and all of that. So in many rural areas, you actually don't have a police station to report any kind of civil altercation to. What that has done, it has created a culture of self-help. People realize that the state cannot secure them, so they will find ways of securing themselves. So today we have a proliferation of ethnic militias or vigilante groups, most of them rooted in ethnic identity. So where you have a land conflict, for example, there is no court, there is no police station to go to. You arm yourselves, you take the young people, you weaponize them, and you have private armies all over the place. I also agree that the impact of military governance on our society is something that we really need to measure. We've not really come to terms with the impact of the militarization of the Nigerian psyche, to the extent that dialogue is not often the first resort. It is violence, first of all, to establish a balance of terror where there is conflict, before we eventually decide to talk. So these are the issues.
Okay, let me quickly bring in Kemi. Obviously, the failings of the state are huge. He's talked about the presence of ungoverned spaces where there's no state presence, the fact that the state is no longer seen as legitimate. And in many ways that is correct, isn't it? Because the primary function of a state is to provide security first and foremost. And we don't see that happening. Why?
Let me back up a bit. My school of thoughts, when we kind of vilify the traditional or informal justice or policing system, I think that's not right. The government or the system, the nation state, is made up of different entities. The traditional institution, the traditional policing system, the traditional justice system have a role to play.
Right.
And if they are the closest to the people and they are the ones that engage the people effectively, the question you ask is, how have we built...
Well, shouldn't they be supplementing?
They're collaborating.
Right, okay.
Yeah, because the government, as we see it, the formal government, as we see it, cannot cover the space. Let's get that straight.
But the argument, though, is that there is even non-existent government to begin with. So these are the only systems that are available to people. The
challenge we have is that there's an erosion of the local government system, which is the closest arm of government to the people. Okay. So you're finding that's where the gap is. So when you ask local government authority, most of them caretakers, most of them appointed, not elected. It's also an element of administration that we do not pay attention to. If there's local government elections going to take place, nobody's going to pay attention to who's going to be your councillor, and that's the form level of local government that is closest to the people. Where that does not exist, you have the traditional system which naturally exists, covering that space.
And yet, the system of policing or our security system is largely controlled from the federal level. That's the way we are structured. Your experience in Kaduna as a state government trying to sort of enforce security at a time of crisis, what are you finding are the challenges given that security is controlled at the center?
Well, thank you very much, Kareria. It's not been easy. We know that whenever we have conflicts in Kaduna, the police force, the army, and the air force, the military, have always are quick to come to our rescue. But it's been tough because it's not in every situation that the governor can give directives to the police authorities. There have been situations where we have asked them to move to certain areas, but they are waiting for certain commands or directives from their head office. You all agree with me by the enabling law establishing them, the police and the Nigerian military are not completely under the control. They are not under the control of the governor, even though we play a significant role in equipping them, in supporting them, even through intelligence sharing and all that from what we get from our traditional rulers, but we're not in control. So to a large extent, it's been a very, very serious challenge.
From the state point of view, are these, in your view, failing or failed institutions? Since they consistently are unable to...
No.
Well, I mean, prevention doesn't seem to be on their radar.
No. To a large extent, like the crisis we just had in Kaduna, the police and the military played a significant role in curtailing. It would have become.
But this is, I'm saying, is after the fact.
After the fact.
Surely part of what you do when you police properly is you actually do preventive policing.
Well, it is true that their intervention is preventive in most cases, but there have also been situations where we got intelligence even before the conflicts do emanate. And then when we have those intelligence, especially from the state security service, we have a security council where we meet once every week, where we share this intelligence. So to a large extent, I would not agree that it's a failure. I know we would want them to do a lot better in our society, but I would not agree.
Let me engage the audience a little bit. The gentleman in the blue shirt, please don't forget to tell us who you are. And please keep it short. Yeah? Time is very fast right there. No, you need a mic. Is that mic on? I'm not too sure. Okay. All right. Go on.
Okay, my name is Abdullahi Haruna. There's something we're not touching. The trigger actors in crisis, manifestation. We're talking about religious institutions, educational institutions, and even the security institutions. The advent of violence in Nigeria actually started or manifested during the preach of supremacy of religion. That era where your religion is better or superior than my own. From if you do not accept Christ, you will not see, Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you are not a believer. If you are not a Muslim, you are Arni. Our religious leaders actually inculcated that in us, and that set the template for that deep-seated animosity that we have today. I
mean, to a certain extent it's true, and I'd like us to talk about the role of religion when I come back to you. But that doesn't explain, for example, why two communities in Delta, that are in a dispute over boundary demarcations will kill themselves. They mostly are likely to speak very similar languages and are also likely to worship in similar ways. I'm not dismissing, and I'd like the panel to actually jump in on this. Anybody regarding,
I'll say it's also a feature of the breakdown of the criminal justice system.
Right.
So criminality should be addressed as criminality. The law books tell us what murder is. However, when some of this violence, when some of these killings take place, you find those that are supposed to implement the law are the ones rationalizing
The reason for the killing.
Yes, the reason for the killing.
Okay. Well, what about the religious institutions? I mean,
I think what I would say is, in agreement with you, but with another layer added on, is violence is multifaceted in Nigeria. So in northern Nigeria, for example, because religion was for a long time the organizing principle of northern Nigeria, when you have both politics and violence in northern Nigeria are layered with religious symbolism and religious metaphors. So in fact, religious institutions in northern Nigeria to a large extent are also socio-political institutions in a way that doesn't happen in the south. In the south, because ethnicity was the organizing principle of society for a long time, violence and politics in the south tend to be layered with ethnic symbolism and ethnic metaphors. And when you go further down south, you know, like in the south-south zone, where there was a long history of...
hang on, is that not because in the south there's a certain degree of cohesion in religion, and the north is a little bit more diverse, both in terms of, particularly in terms of religion? So you've got a huge Christian population, even if, you know, one could argue that the north is predominantly Islamic, and you don't have a similar sort of issue in the south. Is that not the case?
It's a common misconception, but if you're in the southwest, the demographics of the southwest are very plural, very diverse. The southwest is like the middle belt, you know, in terms of the distribution of communities along the lines of Islam and Christianity. So in fact, the southwest is probably a case for positive deviance. If we're ever interested in asking, if you have diversity of faith in the southwest, then why don't you have religious violence in the southwest the way you have it elsewhere? But I was going to add that if you go to the deep south, where there was a long history of secret societies, the violence that manifests there tends to adopt the metaphors and the cultural rights of those secret societies. That is what we call cult violence or cultism, although it's just simply gangsterism wearing cultural garments. So the point is that violence simply wears the cultural garments of different localities. The base factors are probably the same. It's the collapse of the criminal justice system, what to do with millions of alienated young people, and the culture of violence generally that we have. But depending on the locality, it will adopt certain traits, certain characteristics. It would be a mistake to focus on the characteristics or the garments rather than what is wearing them. So in parts of Kaduna, for example, what you have is actually gangsterism. But by the time it assumes full manifestation, you assume that it is religious communities that are fighting. And I would add lastly that there are class dynamics to this that we need to pay attention to. So if you're in Kaduna, for example, a lot of the fighting would go on in Badarawa, right? Badarawa is a slum next door to Malali. If you're in Malali, nothing happens to you in Malali. If you are in Jos, most of the unrest happens in Angwan-Rogo. If you're in Rayfield, nothing happens to you. So there are also class dimensions to the geography of violence that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, so the underlying subtext there, and I want to bring the prof in here, is that poverty and lack of opportunities might actually also play a role. I know you've studied...
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, you know...
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at definitions of national security, those definitions are beginning over time to shift in terms of incorporating sustainable development. So it's no longer security in terms of armed forces going to fight there or pressure on environmental resources. But are now beginning to address core issues of poverty, the unemployment, you know, all the financials are coming in, all the poverty indicators, they're all playing in, they're all coming now in the definitions. So we're beginning to see the impact of this security on a range of variables. First, if you look at macroeconomic indicators, you're going to see how it affects each and every macroeconomic indicator. And I could name them: inflation, GDP, all of them. All these factors are affected. You go and look at socioeconomic indicators, they're all affected. If you look at the budget, you see how security grows with national budget in a linear form, and then you correlate that to GDP.
So the moment you look at health,
you look at provisioning for health in the budget, look at education, you find them in inverse relationships, showing that the trajectory is upward for security-based expenditures, whereas all the other indices that are connected to poverty and sustainable development are all inverse relations. So you're going to have more competition. In fact, while the population is growing phenomenally, there's what they call the demographic time bomb, which says that in the year 2030, there'll be 400 million Nigerians.
Okay, I'm going to have to take a quick break. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Don't go away. Welcome back. You are watching The Core, coming to you live from Channels Television Studios in Abuja, Nigeria. Prof, before the break, you'd started talking to us about the correlation between essentially bad economic indices and conflict. What is the impact of this conflict on us as a people?
Well, you remember, my colleagues have pointed out the scarcity of resources, how it's driving the dynamics. And then we also note competition in the environment when we talk about header crisis. You know, there's environmental issues there. But the population, if you look at the population and the agriculture, look at the two, bring them together. There's no wisdom in an empty stomach. So if you are more educated and you have better sanitation practices, then you reduce the impact of poor health. You get along. But if the population is going to increase, as has been forecasted by 2030 to 300 million, and 70% of the employment is in agriculture, and agriculture is under attack. If I looked at a lot of grains, I looked at maize, rice, sorghum, millet. I looked at them over 30, 40 years. I even looked at our neighbors, Republic of Benin, to see what's good. I looked at all of those, what we produce, what we consume, what we're importing, and what we're exporting, and I tell you, we're in serious trouble.
So food security is an issue.
We're in serious trouble because whilst all of these are being heavily affected by violence and all this violence, and are deepening, at the same time, the population is expanding at 3.2% and 300 million, and the people who are growing the food are over 60 years. So by 2030, a lot of them already are on the departure lounge with their boarding passes. So I don't know. The young people are not engaging in agriculture. I don't know who's going to grow the food that we're going to eat. And the places where we're growing the food, if you look at the pattern, you see that where maize and millets are grown are where you have more effect of the northeast.
Conflict.
And, you've seen them. And then in the IDP camp, you have to feed them.
Okay, let me try and bring in members of the audience. Yes, the gentleman in the red tie, please.
I'm Comrade Engineer Igbini Odafe Emmanuel. I live in Warri. While I agree with us, with what we have said so far, but I slightly believe that we are not addressing the core issue. I grew up in Kaduna. I attended Army Children's School Kakuri, where I graduated in 1978. My best friend was Muhammad Ali, a Muslim. Throughout my youthful days in Kaduna, there was nothing like crisis. Now, you talked about Alaja and Ogbejo. Those are communities I know very well. The major players, I know them. What are the issues? The fact of it is that few of us who are privileged to be elites today have taken the real essence of life out of the average Nigerian. There is now total hopelessness. I am a gentleman today. The moment I realize that there's no hope tomorrow, I will not be any different from those Boko Haram people. So we must have to restore values to life. In Niger Delta, you are aware that at the time, most of our brothers took up arms. We won't die, we're ready to die. They were ready to die. But the moment the former president, Yar'Adua, may so rest in peace, now came up with amnesty and empowered them, most of them now don't want to hear anything called Bege. They even move with security.
Is this purely an economic issue? This is where the problem is. Okay, is this purely an economic issue?
Go
on.
Well, I wouldn't say it's purely economic. One of the issues we have witnessed, case study of Kaduna, is the fact that over the years, when conflicts emerge, committees are set up, commissions are set up, they make far-reaching recommendations which are never, or they're just partly implemented. And one of those recommendations they keep making, certain people are identified and certain organizations are asked to prosecute those people. But those people who are identified as culprits, never ever get to see the courts.
So there's impunity,
there's
but
impunity.
Is that an aftermath as opposed to a sort of a fundamental underlying cause?
No. You see, it may be an aftermath in respect of a particular conflict, but because you've not punished the man who was responsible for the last one, the next man sees after another conflict, he believes that if I do it this same way, I will not be punished. Or the same man who he saw looting his store, he will see him the next market day because the man is never arrested or is not punished. So you have this cycle of violence, people committing the same thing and going scot-free and never punished.
Chris, you were about to say something before.
Yes, it's not purely economics, but in my view it is largely economics. Identity matters, but identity becomes even more important where there's material scarcity and your access to resources is based on identity. That's why I started by saying that violence is sown into the fabric of our society. So, sir, you're from Warri. In Warri, during the 90s into the early 2000s, there was this conflict between the Ishekiris and the Urhobos. Ishekiris and Urhobos are the most intermarried ethnic group, or interrelated, by some accounts in this country. How do you explain that? My argument is that if, using the metaphor of a polygamous home, if there's abundance, everybody is happy. The moment there is lack, people start to remember whose children come from the second wife or the third wife or the fourth wife or the concubine. In other words, hierarchies become important. So I am saying that our identity issues are, diversity is not Nigeria's problem. It's been our inability to manage diversity.
Okay, let me bring Kate in here because there was another issue he also alluded to about growing up in Kaduna. And, I dare say there's that generation which sort of saw, if you like, a fairly decently functioning Nigeria. People like us are sort of now in our 40s and our 50s. And there's a whole generation that doesn't know anything except ethnic and religious conflict. What is the impact of that on sort of social cohesion?
It breaks the fabric, and I'll tell you a story. I was talking to my niece some months back in Lagos, and one of her friends came to visit. My sisters and I are not married from our ethnic group. We married outside the group. So her friend mentioned her name to me, and the first thing, silly me, I was like, "Where are you from?" And the little girl, 9, 10, looked at me and said to me, "I'm a Nigerian." And I felt foolish because, I mean, what do I want to do with where she's from? Because she's also a product of an inter-ethnic marriage. So her name does not tell you any particular group. It just comes together, And I think for some of us in inter-ethnic marriages, we kind of feel that maybe our kids can be the hope of that new tomorrow. Even
though they're growing up in an environment in which incessant killings are taking place.
They're growing up in an environment in which incessant killings are taking place. However, you are preaching the message of unity.
Okay.
Right?
Let me bring in members of the audience. Yes, let's do maybe the lady in the middle. And then we'll come to you, sir, and you, and then we'll quickly come back to the panel. Please keep it short. We're running out of time, And I do want us to talk about solutions.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Jennifer Gadi. I think we should look at the way in the states, the residential areas, besides the class thing, we have a particular ethnic group staying in this side of town, and then a particular ethnic group staying on this side of town. Like, I also live in Kaduna. From the bridge, like Kaduna South, you have this particular ethnic group staying here, or this particular faith, that's your religion, and then this other side is like there's a demarcation.
But it wasn't always the case, though.
Yeah.
So those of us who were born in Kaduna know that. These are things that happened as a result of the conflict.
And then, from when you leave the house, you know that, okay, I'm living from Kaduna South, I'm going to Kaduna North to work, and then you meet these people, and then that mindset
is there.
It's there. Okay. So it starts from us.
The gentleman with the black tie, please.
Okay. My name is Senator Irebu, publisher of Global Sentinel. online magazine that deals on conflict issue. But I want to align with Chris.
There are two Chris's, by the way.
Chris Ngodo, my friend, that one of the critical challenges or the issue is this identity politics. And if you look globally right now, it's a problem not in Nigeria, but all over the world. Before, when migrants go to Europe, it's not much of a problem because Europe were wealthy then. Like he noted, the population is increasing and the resources is getting scarcer. So now how do people begin to know who gets what? They begin to go to their identity enclave. But what is at the core of this is the failure of the state. The failure of the state to build a cohesive either unity or manage our diversity. Are we a federal system or are we a unitary system? We will not be able to answer this question. And that is what at the core of this. And each component begin to take laws into their hands.
The gentleman in white.
I'm Lukman Akintola. I'd like to say that first, intolerance breeds hate speech. And because we all have our differences, if we are unable to tolerate ourselves, there are a lot of hate speeches. And if you follow the Yaga report that was released yesterday, ahead of next election, there are already issues of hate speeches running around. But we need to understand that the structure, our society, I don't know why I want to fill a form and they will tell me I should put my state of origin. It's a major problem. That's a structural problem that beats division amongst us. And I think it's what that needs to be addressed. And we still need to address the issue of media framing of reports too. Okay. The way we frame our reports is very important, and it shows how long conflict can linger on in our society. Okay.
He raised a few important topics. Can you take the mic to the back down there? And I will just engage the panel very quickly before we come to you. He raised a number of issues of around basically where you live and how that sort of translates. These are issues for you in Kaduna, are they not?
Very, very true. Very, very true. It is true that is the issue. That's a big problem in Kaduna. If you go, people live across the divide. Some who live in the Barna area, majority of them are Christians, and then what they call is across the bridge. She knows that very well. So in 2007, the state government the legislature passed the Peace Commission bill, which established the Kaduna State Peace Commission. Now, one of the mandates of this Peace Commission is to be able to sit down with all the stakeholders in the state to see how they can reorientate people and see areas where they can ensure peaceful and harmonious coexistence amongst people. In addition to that, what the state government also did is that we reintroduced the issue of the boarding school system, which has completely left our society. My mom went to, I'm from the southern part of Kaduna, Zone 3 senatorial district. My mom, many years ago, went to school in Soba Zaria. But it wouldn't happen in today's world. You wouldn't find somebody from Zaria sending his child or ward to go and school in Kaguru. Okay.
I want to see if we can get into a conversation about whether there's a chance we can self-correct. So maybe we should wait and take a break, and then when we come back, we'll carry on. Okay. Don't go away.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You are watching The Core. With only a few minutes to go before the end of the program, I'd like to come back to this panel very quickly, starting perhaps with Prof. Do we stand a chance of actually reversing these issues? What can we do? Quickly, solutions.
Of course we can. I just come back from a week of intensive training of our defense forces, all of them, and we're looking at a new security architecture that interrogates some of these social, cultural, religious issues, but also fully aware of the dimensions of the implications for sustainable development area. You know, I talked about agriculture, and I mapped population on top of it, but I haven't mapped migration pattern on top of it. We're only about 48% in the urban. We'll be 75% in 2030.
So solutions. So
in terms of solutions, now we're going to look at new architecture that would actually do more talking, do more community policing, do more connection with the vigilante. There are many more things we have to connect with so that the culture of violence, which begets violence, recedes.
Okay. Gary?
I think we need to look at the root causes. A lot of times we're looking at enabling and building capacity or responding through the security agencies. Education is there, we're not addressing it. Unemployment is there, we're not addressing it. We need to define what education is to us. Is education reading and writing in English, or education ability to reason logically and understand the implications of your action, even if it's in your native dialect?
Would you like to see a larger budget, when you move money away from, say, defense?
It doesn't have to be that.
And security,
yes,
to
naturally you spread across, but it shouldn't. I don't think we should limit ourselves to English. That's just it. I think we should go back to the basic. What was it that we had that kept us going in the 60s, in the 50s, and reignite that? Even agriculture, if we're talking agriculture, how do you make agriculture attractive and sustainable for the younger generation so that they plug into it? Because everybody can get a white collar job.
How are you dealing with this in Kaduna? Because we can talk to you from a practical point of view because you are in government.
In Kaduna, instead of looking at it on the surface or scratching the surface as has been the case, we have decided to look at the root cause of this problem. Like I said earlier, we identified unemployment as one of the key issues. So as part of our state development plan, we have set up what we call the Kaduna Investment Promotion Agency, which has tried...
So employment, yes, I have to rush you because I have to...
We have the issue of employment, drug abuse. We've set up agency, drug abuse to try and resolve the issue of... And then a conversation that we must have is the issue of indigenous settlership in respect of land.
You are trying to abolish that,
yes, in Kaduna, but if it's a conversation that we need to have as a country, because we need to have it at the top.
Grace, you have the final word, and you've got about a minute.
A minute, fine. So we need economic growth, because all of this is easier when there's food on the table and people feel that their material circumstances are changing. We need a strong law and order approach that punishes crime as crime, not as activism by religious or ethnic groups. Kaduna became segregated over the years because people ran away from places where neighbors killed their relatives. So you need to punish crime as crime. We need a restoration of local governance. There's no governance outside of state capitals. We need a restoration of local governance that delivers on social deliverables, education, healthcare, access to good infrastructure, that sort of thing. Things that give people's life meanings. Absolutely, it's possible. Absolutely. You need the right leadership to do that. We need the right leadership to do that.
Okay, so it all boils down to politics. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I thank my panelists, the two Chris's, Kemi and Prof. Thank you so much for coming. The studio audience, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of you. It's the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. The clock just ticks really quickly. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of Channels Television and Daria Media, I'm Kadria Ahmed, wishing you a happy 2019 in advance.